Just a nurse. That is what Dr. Richard Mercer had written in the margin of her credential file, right next to her 3 medical certifications and her perfect patient care evaluations. Just a nurse. He didn't know she'd spent 8 years as a captain in Special Forces, conducting surgical raids in the Jolan district of Fallujah, or that insurgents had whispered her call sign, Jinn, with the kind of fear that made grown men hold their breath. He had no idea that the quiet woman pushing the medication cart down the Norfolk VA hospital corridor at 6:38 a.m. had carried a dying Marine 3 miles through enemy fire to the extraction point at FOB Shank. He didn't see the precision in how she moved, the way her eyes assessed every room like a tactical landscape, reading threat vectors in the placement of stands and the body language of staff members. He saw only what his contempt had already decided was true, a credential-less nurse trying to perform work beyond her station. Ashley Cooper had chosen Norfolk for a reason. The VA hospital stretched across 8 city blocks, its corridors a labyrinth of wards and rehabilitation wings and administrative offices that made it perfect cover for what she was actually doing here. Nobody asked too many questions about a nurse who kept to herself, who volunteered for the night shifts, who seemed content to exist in the margins of the medical hierarchy. The dual role had seemed manageable at first, 6 years working medical floors as cover for the joint VA investigation that had become her life now. 8 months of careful intelligence gathering. Medication diversion case spanning 3 states and 2 federal agencies. Everything meticulously documented in secure channels she accessed from a phone that looked like every other iPhone but carried encrypted Pentagon channels that would vaporize if anyone tried to compromise it. The investigation was supposed to be invisible. Ashley was supposed to be invisible. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone as she arrived at 6:15 a.m., 40 minutes before the first shift supervisor clocked in. The antiseptic smell of the hospital mixed with floor wax and something older, the smell of a place where people had died and healed and lost their minds by increments, all in the same beige-walled rooms. Her badge clipped to her scrub pocket, the name read, A. Cooper, RN. Nothing more. No rank. No history. No legend. She moved through the rehabilitation wing with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to operate invisible, her shoes whispering on the linoleum tiles, her movements economical and precise. The hand warmer she'd stuffed into her scrub pockets felt smooth and familiar, like ritual, like muscle memory that hadn't forgotten anything even if civilian life pretended it could. The locker room was empty. 6:19 a.m. She opened her locker, 3rd row, corner unit, and retrieved the folded flag from the shelf behind her extra shift shoes. It was smaller than she'd expected when Jenkins had pressed it into her hands outside the field hospital in Kandahar 8 years ago. She'd held the body before they took it. Captain Marcus Webb had weighed less when he was gone than when he'd been alive, as if his absence had actual mass. The flag was the color of old blood now, dyed that way by dust and time and the things she couldn't talk about. She held it for exactly 4 seconds, no more, no less, and let her eyes close while her hand stayed perfectly still. When she opened them again, she folded it one more time, pressed it against the corner of the locker shelf, and closed the metal door. The sound of the latch was like a gunshot in the empty room. By 7:41 a.m., Dr. Richard Mercer had already made his observations. He'd been watching her since her hire 6 weeks ago, and what he'd observed was enough to confirm his suspicions about the corruption of merit-based hiring practices. The woman had solid certifications, a current RN license, PCCN, ACLS, CPR. Nothing exceptional. No university affiliation that mattered. No family connections to speak of. No pedigree. She'd appeared out of nowhere, hired by a middle manager who'd since been reassigned, and now she was working his hospital, and he could not understand why. Worse, she was competent. That bothered him more than anything else. Her patient's vital signs tracked within acceptable ranges. Her charting was meticulous. She anticipated physician orders before they were spoken. The kind of anticipation that came from experience. But what experience? Her resume was sparse. No prior hospital names that mattered. No publications. No research. Just 6 years of what looked like quiet, careful work in low-profile facilities. He watched her move through the rehab wing at 8:15 a.m., her movements efficient and economical, checking patient status boards, adjusting fours, doing the 1,000 small invisible things that kept people alive. She moved like someone accustomed to operating in hostile environments, he would think later, if he ever allowed himself to think in those terms. But he didn't think in those terms. He thought in terms of credentials and connections and the careful networks of power that held institutions together. And this woman threatened something about those networks that he couldn't quite articulate. So he simply decided to discredit her. The notation in her file had been casual enough, credential verification incomplete. Recommend continued investigation. That was all. 3 words that would begin the machinery moving against her, slowly at first, then with the inexorable weight of institutional bureaucracy. The rehabilitation wing hummed with its morning rhythm. Nurses passed each other in quick exchanges. Therapists set up parallel bars for ambulation training. The smell of coffee lingered in the staff room, mixing with the antiseptic wash that maintenance had applied to the floors just after sunrise. Ashley approached the patient in room 412, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, readmission for pneumonia follow-up and mobility assessment. His wheelchair was positioned near the window, and he faced the glass with the vacant expression of someone looking at nothing. His left forearm, visible where his sleeve had ridden up, displayed the tattoo in fading black ink, Ashley. A single name. Her name. But the traumatic brain injury that had ravaged his temporal and parietal lobes 2 years ago had severed the connections that would have made that name mean anything. She looked at him and he looked through her. "Good morning, Sergeant Webb," she said, her voice pitched low and steady, the kind of voice that didn't demand response, only presence. "I'm going to check your oxygen saturation and blood pressure this morning. Let me know if you need anything." He blinked. His eyes tracked the sound of her voice but didn't focus. The frontal lobe damage had left him cognitively intact enough for basic function but emotionally scattered, unable to form new memories, unable to recognize faces even when they belonged to people whose names he carried on his skin. She'd read his chart 6 times. She knew the neurology by heart. The injury pattern. The prognosis. The permanent nature of the amnesia that would leave him in this state, alive but disconnected, breathing but unreachable. She'd carried him through Baghdad as a dying man. Now she was carrying him through Norfolk as a stranger. The pulse oximeter clipped to his right index finger. The numbers appeared on the small screen, oxygen saturation 96%. Normal. The blood pressure cuff inflated around his left arm, the tattooed arm, the one that carried her name where it had once carried meaning. 118/72. Normal. Everything normal. Everything functional. Everything except the part that would have made any of this matter. "Your vitals look good today, Sergeant Webb," she said, removing the cuff with gentle efficiency. "The respiratory therapy team will be here at 10 for your breathing exercises. Try to stay rested until then." He nodded in acknowledgement of words he might not retain, movements that were automatic rather than understood. She adjusted his blanket. The fabric was soft, hospital-issued, the color of institutional compromise. Her hands were steady. Steady the way hands had to be in Baghdad when you were threading sutures under indirect fire. Steady the way they had to be now, when you were touching a man who carried your name but couldn't remember your face. She was documenting his vitals in the electronic chart at the nurse's station when she felt the weight of observation. Dr. Mercer stood at the far end of the station, his arms crossed, his expression arranged in an expression of casual assessment that was anything but casual. He was watching her the way a predator watches prey, cataloguing weakness, searching for the moment when her guard would drop and he could strike. She registered this without looking directly at him. Just a slight awareness in her peripheral vision, a shift in her posture that made her seem less present, less remarkable. She completed the chart entry. 8:27 a.m. The notation closed with a secure timestamp. Normal. Invisible. Just a nurse doing the work that nurses do. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Mercer had already decided she was a problem. And problems, in his experience, could be systematized. By the end of her first week, he'd requested her credential verification files. By the end of the second week, he'd begun circulating questions about her background during departmental meetings. Nothing accusatory. Nothing that would draw the attention of administration. Just subtle suggestions of incompleteness. Her nursing school, where exactly was that? Her prior employment history, somewhat sparse, wasn't it? Her references, why had only 2 agreed to speak on record? The seeds were planted. The machinery was turning. And Ashley Cooper, who had survived 8 years in the most hostile environment the United States military could place her in, who had taken 2 bullets and still called for extraction on her team before herself, who had earned the respect of the most dangerous men in special operations by being even more dangerous and twice as competent, she was about to discover that there were forms of warfare that didn't require weapons at all. The Grand Rounds conference room on the 3rd floor of the Norfolk VA hospital smelled like stale coffee and institutional anxiety. 12 staff members sat in a semicircle of chairs, their attention focused on the wooden podium where Dr. Richard Mercer stood with a patient chart held between 2 fingers, as if the documentation itself might contaminate him. Ashley Cooper occupied a chair in the back row, her posture identical to that of every other nurse in the room, present but unremarkable, the kind of invisible presence that made her perfect for work that required observation without recognition. Mercer's voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to authority without question. "I want to discuss something we've observed in recent weeks," he began, his eyes scanning the assembled staff before settling on a specific chart notation. "This is what dangerously substandard care looks like." He held up the page. Ashley's handwriting was precise, clinical, each letter formed with the same steady pressure she'd learned in a combat field hospital outside Sadra City. The chart belonged to Marcus Webb, the wheelchair-bound veteran with her name tattooed on his arm. She watched Mercer's lips curl slightly as he began to read. Patient presenting with elevated heart rate post-rehabilitation session. Vitals trending upward. Ordered routine cardiac panel per attending physician. Nurse notes, patient appeared anxious about upcoming surgery, mentioned fear of anesthesia. Recommended anxiolytic consultation with psychiatric services before procedure. Mercer lowered the chart. "This nurse here believes her instincts supersede evidence-based protocol." The word instincts hung in the air like a slur. Dr. Patterson, sitting 3 chairs to the left, suddenly became very interested in the edge of his clipboard. Dr. Ruiz cleared his throat and looked toward the window. "Notice," Mercer continued, his tone taking on a theatrical quality that made Ashley's jaw tighten imperceptibly, "how Nurse Cooper here thinks she's special. Thinks she's qualified to make psychiatric recommendations." He turned the chart sideways. "Where is the medication order? Where is the physician authorization? Instead, we get nursing intuition. We get what Nurse Nightingale thinks might help." He smiled thinly at his own nickname, waiting for the room to provide uncomfortable laughter that never quite came. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a clinical glow across the room. Ashley felt the weight of second-hand embarrassment radiating from the other nurses. They knew better than to make eye contact, knew that acknowledgement would make them complicit. Her fingers, resting on the clipboard in her lap, remained steady. Her breathing pattern didn't change. The tension coiling in her spine, the kind of coiled tension that preceded violence in hostile territory, stayed locked behind her ribs where it belonged. "We will be implementing new documentation standards," Mercer concluded, placing the chart on the podium with deliberate care. "Every nursing note written by Nurse Cooper will require attending physician co-signature before entering the system. Quality assurance, you understand. We can't have individual nurses deciding they know better than the evidence." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, but Ashley had already compartmentalized the humiliation into a separate category of her mind. She'd learned to do this in Baghdad, segregate the emotional response from the operational moment. Feel it later. Survive it now. Her eyes remained on Mercer as he spoke about infection prevention protocols, her expression neutral as her hands continued their work across the keyboard in her lap where no one could see. 2 days later, the vending machine in the staff lounge hummed its electric song while Ashley stood in front of it, contemplating the predetermined selection of chips and candy bars that constituted the hospital's nutritional offerings. She'd been running on black coffee and hospital cafeteria salads for 18 hours. The muscle in her lower back had begun to protest the 9-hour night shift she'd just finished, and she was considering whether anything in this machine was worth the calories. The lounge door opened. Dr. Patterson and Dr. Ruiz entered mid-conversation, their coffee cups steaming with the warmth of something recently poured. They were discussing an upcoming golf tournament, something about handicaps and a course in Virginia Beach. Ashley heard them before she looked at them, heard the easy camaraderie that suggested neither was thinking about medication diversion investigations or federal protocols or the small things that happened in supply closets when no one was watching. She turned slightly. "Hey, Patterson." "Ruiz." Both men's heads snapped toward her like she'd switched on an alarm. For exactly 1 second, their eyes met hers, a moment of recognition that said they'd heard something they shouldn't have, that they'd been warned about associating with the nurse who thought she was special. Their coffee cups found the table. Their bodies pivoted. They turned their backs and walked toward the door without speaking a single word. The mechanical hum of the vending machine continued its steady rhythm. Ashley stood motionless, watching their shoulders disappear through the doorway, and then she pressed D7 for the protein bar she didn't actually want. The machine made a grinding sound and delivered her purchase. She left the lounge without looking back, moving through the hospital corridors with the same purposeful stride she'd used to navigate the streets of Baghdad, present, professional, unremarkable. That afternoon, the machinery of Dr. Mercer's orchestration shifted into a new gear. Ashley was leaving the ICU after checking on a post-operative patient when his voice found her in the corridor outside the nursing station. Not a request for a meeting. Not a private conversation. A public announcement designed for witnesses. Just a heads up, Cooper. Security escorts for terminated employees are standard protocol around here. Nothing personal. He smiled, and the smile was the dangerous part, not angry, not aggressive, but the careful expression of someone who'd learned that power operated most effectively when delivered politely. 2 orderlies at the station nearby began rearranging supplies they'd arranged 5 minutes earlier. A resident studying the computer screen became suddenly fascinated with patient vitals that didn't require his attention. "We'd just like to make sure people leave with only what belongs to them," Mercer continued, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "Clear on that?" Ashley's signature was perfectly steady as she signed the medication log he'd thrust toward her. Each letter formed with the same precision she'd used to write a letter to Marcus Webb's family 4 years ago, the one she never sent because the war had deemed his injuries classified, had deemed her own presence in that convoy classified, had deemed the entire narrative of what happened that day in Baghdad something that would never exist in any official record. "Perfectly clear, Doctor," she said quietly. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds was the entirety of her training, her discipline, and the terrifying calm that came from having already survived the worst. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded and walked away, satisfied that he'd made his point. Alone in the supply closet 10 minutes later, surrounded by vacuum-sealed packages of sterile gloves and boxes of 18-gauge catheters, Ashley's hand did something her public composure would never permit. It shook. Just slightly. Just enough that she had to grip the metal shelving unit until the trembling stopped, until her breathing steadied, until she'd locked that moment away with all the others, the mortars in Fallujah, the extraction at 0300 hours, the blood on her uniform that she'd washed out in a portable shower while maintaining perfect operational focus. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the weight of knowing exactly what she was capable of, exactly what would happen if she allowed herself to respond to Mercer's threats in any way that reflected her actual training. It was the discipline that separated a captain from a civilian, that separated someone who could destroy a career in 4 words from someone who said perfectly clear, "Doctor," and signed medication logs. She released the shelf and checked her watch. The night shift started in 2 hours. She would return to her car, sit in the parking lot, and send an encrypted message to her handler at the DOD liaison office. She would report that the cover was degrading, that the machinery of institutional sabotage was accelerating, and that she had precisely 1 week before Marcus Webb's preoperative surgery, the moment when her access to the patient records would determine whether a classified intelligence operation succeeded or collapsed completely. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Mercer had no idea what he was actually dismantling. The worst part was that his petty campaign for institutional credibility was interfering with something that had nothing to do with his medical ego and everything to do with 247 American soldiers whose fates depended on Ashley Cooper maintaining her cover for exactly 7 more days. The monitor screamed first. One continuous wail that turned every head in the rehabilitation wing toward Marcus Webb's room. Ashley was 3 doors down, checking vitals on a 78-year-old with CHF, when she heard it. She didn't run. Running meant panic. She moved instead, the kind of movement that looked casual until you watched closely enough to see the precision in it, the economy of motion that came from someone who'd learned to navigate hostile terrain on foot. Marcus sat in his wheelchair by the window, his breathing suddenly wrong. Not labored. Wrong. His face had shifted from the weathered tan of a man who'd spent 40 years in the sun to something closer to ash, and his jaw was working like a fish pulled from water, mouth open, no sound coming out except the wet pull of air that wasn't reaching where it needed to go. His oxygen sat at 98 on the pulse ox. Then 94. Then 84. His trachea, Ashley saw it immediately, had begun to deviate. A visible shift to the left, like someone had taken the center of his neck and twisted it sideways. His jugular veins were distending, the skin above his collarbone starting to cave inward with each attempted breath. Every sign pointed to the same clinical picture. Tension pneumothorax. One of his lungs had collapsed, and now the pressure was building inside his chest cavity, compressing his heart, crushing his ability to breathe. The attending physician, Dr. Sanchez, was reaching for the phone. "I'm calling rapid response. Someone get me the crash cart." There was no rapid response time for this. Rapid response was 5 minutes minimum on a good day. Marcus had perhaps 90 seconds before cardiac arrest became inevitable. Ashley could see the calculation happening in the microsecond before she moved. She could see the moment when her hands, calloused, scarred, steady as surgical steel, reached for the 14-gauge needle from the crash cart before anyone had even finished pushing it through the doorway. Could see the way Sanchez's eyes widened, the way his protest formed on his lips and died there because he already knew. He already understood. She didn't explain. Explanations required time that Marcus didn't have. She located the second intercostal space by palpation, found the midclavicular line by feel the way someone finds a light switch in a house they've lived in for 20 years. Her fingers moved across his ribs with the kind of certainty that comes from having done this before, having done this under worse conditions, having done this in a place where the only light came from muzzle flashes and the only sound was screaming. The needle went in smooth. Clinical. Precise. No hesitation. No second guessing. The kind of movement that looked like muscle memory because some things didn't live in textbooks or nursing protocols, they lived in the nervous system, in the space between thought and action where training and survival merged into something that looked like instinct but was actually just competence wearing the mask of intuition. The hiss of air. That was the sound that made the difference. That whisper of pressure escaping, the rush of gas that had been suffocating Marcus Webb's lungs finding release. His oxygen climbed immediately. 92. 95. 98. His face shifted back from ash gray to something approaching human. His breathing steadied. The panic in his eyes didn't disappear completely, but it receded just enough for him to understand that he was still alive, that the world wasn't ending, that there would be a next breath and a breath after that. Sanchez was staring at her like she'd just performed surgery with her teeth. "How did you? That's not in any nursing protocol. That's not." He stopped. Restarted. "That's a physician-level intervention." Ashley wasn't listening. She was already moving toward the monitor, checking the numbers, confirming the readings, making sure there wasn't a secondary complication waiting in the margins. Her hands worked without her having to think about them. That was the luxury of training. That was what 8 years of military medicine brought you that no civilian nursing program could teach, the ability to function in a crisis state with the kind of clarity that made everything else fall away. Other staff had gathered in the doorway. A respiratory therapist. 2 nurses. a custodian who'd heard the commotion. All of them watching Ashley like she'd just stepped out of a science fiction film and proved that she was something other than what she'd been pretending to be. Marcus looked up at her. His breathing was still ragged, still recovering, but his eyes had that clarity that came with not being actively suffocated. He looked right through her. No recognition. No spark of memory. Just a confused veteran trying to understand why he'd nearly died and why a nurse in scrubs was moving around his chest like she was checking the alignment on a rifle. She didn't expect him to remember. That was the cruelest part of his injury, that her name was written on his arm in permanent ink and his brain had rewritten itself into a place where she was just another person in white, just another uniform that didn't connect to any history. The phone call came 8 minutes later. Not to Ashley. To Dr. Mercer. Someone had called him immediately. The administrative machinery was precise about these things. A nurse performing what could be classified as a procedure outside her scope of practice. Witnesses. Documentation that could be questioned. Potential liability. Potential scrutiny. Everything that made institutional leadership nervous. Mercer appeared in the doorway of Marcus Webb's room at 1:44 p.m., according to the clock on the wall. Ashley noted the time the way she noted everything, small details, patterns, the granular specificity that came from a training regimen that had taught her to observe before acting. His face held that expression she'd learned to recognize, not anger, not yet, but something colder. Strategic assessment. A man who understood power and how to leverage it was calculating the angle of an attack. He didn't speak to Marcus. Didn't acknowledge the patient he was supposedly responsible for. His eyes locked on Ashley with the precision of a targeting system acquiring a lock, and she felt the weight of it the way she'd felt the weight of crosshairs on her back in another place, another life where people tried to kill her for reasons that were usually economic or religious or both. His power base was institutional. That was what made him dangerous in a way that was different from danger, in a way that didn't require weapons because the hospital itself was the weapon. His brother-in-law was a hospital board member. His academic credentials came from pedigree institutions that still carried weight in certain circles. He had allies in the state licensing office. 3 phone calls and he could unravel everything she'd constructed. He knew it. More importantly, she could see that he knew it. Could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the recognition that her competence was a liability now, that her ability to save lives was a problem that required solving through administrative channels rather than medical ones. "My office," he said. "Now." It wasn't a request. The tone made that perfectly clear. But Ashley moved with the same composure she'd maintained while performing a procedure under pressure. Same steady pace. Same lack of visible emotion. She wasn't trembling. Wasn't panicked. Wasn't feeling anything that would show on her face or in the way her body carried itself down the corridor. The hallway fluorescent lights cast everything in the kind of clarity that made nowhere to hide. Her footsteps matched his rhythm, neither rushing nor lagging, maintaining perfect spacing like they were synchronized to some internal metronome. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice, when she had to use it to confirm she understood where she was going, came out level and professional. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't defend what she'd just done without exposing why she could do it. Couldn't explain the training or the muscle memory or the certifications that she held but couldn't mention because acknowledging them would mean explaining her real identity to someone who was already constructing the narrative that would remove her. And that couldn't happen. Not with 7 days remaining. Not when the entire investigation depended on her maintaining cover long enough to identify which pharmacy technician had been diverting controlled substances for the past 4 months. Not when 247 American soldiers' medications depended on her being invisible enough to see what needed to be seen. She had 9 minutes to figure out how to survive the next hour. Dr. Mercer's office door clicked shut behind Ashley at 2:41 p.m. The chief nursing officer sat rigid in the leather chair beside his desk, her expression carefully neutral, the expression of someone who'd been called into a meeting and told not to speak unless directly questioned. Mercer held Ashley's medical chart in both hands like a prosecutor holding evidence, his fingers pale against the blue cover. An investigation into unauthorized medical procedures, he read aloud, his voice flat and bureaucratic as a recording. Practicing beyond your scope of licensure. Potential credential falsification. He set the paperwork on his desk with the precision of a man laying down a winning card. The state licensing board has been notified. Your access to patient floors is revoked effective immediately. You've been reassigned to night janitorial supervisor duties pending the formal hearing. Ashley's jaw remained level. Her hands lay folded in her lap, steady as surgical steel. She didn't blink. She didn't move. The silence in the room became its own pressure, like standing at depth underwater, everything compressed, everything waiting. Do you understand the gravity of this situation, Ms. Cooper? I understand. Her voice came out even, almost monotone. When does the assignment begin? Mercer's eyes narrowed fractionally. He'd expected something else, emotion, defensiveness, the trembling collapse of a woman watching her career disintegrate. Instead he got back composure that looked almost military in its discipline. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Tonight. You'll report to Building C, basement level, at 2,100 hours. Your badge access is being reprogrammed. No patient care areas. No medications. No patient contact of any kind. He turned to the chief nursing officer. I assume the HR file is already flagged. Yes, she said quietly. Terminated status pending investigation closure. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their relentless electronic song. Somewhere down the hallway, a code blue alarm sounded, someone else's emergency, someone else's crisis. Ashley registered it the way a trained sailor registers a distant storm warning. Information. Data. Nothing more. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. She didn't reach for it. A text message in military-grade encryption, abort. Mission compromised. Exfil at 1900 hours. 8 months of work. 247 service members whose medications had been diverted into a trafficking network that reached from Norfolk to 3 forward operating bases in the Middle East. 8 months of invisible position, of watching, documenting, building the case file that would dismantle the entire operation. All of it scattered now like ash in a high wind. She stood. The movement was smooth, deliberate, the opposite of rushed. Is there anything else, Dr. Mercer? Your employee ID will be deactivated at 1,700 hours. Security will escort you from the building. Understood. She walked out through the door he didn't open for her, past the chief nursing officer who still wouldn't meet her eyes, down the corridor where the code blue had already faded into background noise. The rehabilitation wing stretched out to her left, where Marcus Webb sat in his wheelchair, where the folded flag waited in her locker, where everything she built had just collapsed into rubble. The basement laundry smelled of hot detergent and industrial bleach, the kind of smell that got into your scrubs and never fully left. Ashley carried her uniform whites in a canvas bag, the fabric still creased from her last shift. The laundry manager, an older woman named Dorothy who'd worked there for 17 years and always smiled at her, was folding linens when she arrived. Dorothy looked up, and her expression shifted, some small realization crossing her face about why this particular nurse was returning her scrubs on a Wednesday afternoon instead of Friday. She took them without comment. Ashley unfolded the whites slowly. She refolded them with the same mechanical precision she'd used to fold her combat uniform 1,000 times before, creases sharp as knife cuts, corners aligned at perfect 90-degree angles, the precision of someone whose training had taught her that discipline was the only thing you could control when everything else fell apart. The weight of failure pressed against her chest like a sandbag. Like a body. Like the body of Private First Class Marcus Webb, before he'd become a wheelchair and a tattoo and a name she'd carried across 2 continents. I'm sorry, Dorothy said quietly. Don't be. Ashley's voice was steady as a bassline rhythm. It was always going to happen. She placed the folded scrubs on the counter, a stack of blue fabric that represented 8 months of invisibility, now rendered useless. Dorothy accepted them without meeting her eyes, the social contamination of disgrace complete. In a hospital, in any institutional hierarchy, failure was contagious. You didn't get close to it. You didn't make eye contact. You moved to the other side of the corridor and pretended you hadn't seen. The staff entrance was through the loading dock, past the medical waste containers and the dumpsters that smelled of blood and saline. Ashley's ID badge had already been deactivated. She tested it on the electronic lock one final time, and it flashed red. The lock clicked. Access denied. The door didn't open. She sat in her car for 17 minutes, hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock. Her breathing was controlled, rhythmic, the pattern she'd learned in Baghdad when the world was exploding and the only thing that mattered was the next breath. Through the windshield, she watched nurses and doctors and orderlies walking across the parking lot. The hospital still stood. The machinery of healing and hierarchy and institutional power still rotated without her. She'd been erased from it already, her presence scrubbed out as cleanly as a medication diversion from a digital record. She drove away at 4:22 p.m. The mission was over. The cover was compromised beyond recovery. She'd failed the service members who were counting on her. She'd failed the investigation. She'd failed Marcus Webb, who sat somewhere in the rehabilitation wing with her name tattooed on his arm and no memory of why it mattered. The next morning, she returned to the hospital only to collect her personal items. Not as a nurse, as a civilian, as a stranger, just another visitor in scrubs passing through corridors that no longer belonged to her. The locker in the staff break room was still hers for 72 more hours, pending the formal termination paperwork. She entered the combination, her mother's birthday, year of commission, the number of people she'd called in a single medevac operation. The door swung open. The folded flag sat on the top shelf, the fabric worn soft from handling, the creases permanent. She lifted it carefully, like it was made of something more fragile than cloth. Below it lay a photograph of her Special Forces unit, the one that had taken her into Sadr City 7 times without losing a single operator under her command. Her stethoscope hung on a hook below that, the earpieces darkened by months of use. She placed all 3 items in a gym bag. She closed the locker. She walked out of the staff break room, past the vending machines where she'd stood invisible while colleagues turned their backs, past the nurses' station where Mercer had read her notes aloud as examples of incompetence, past the rehabilitation wing where she could hear, through the open door, the sound of a therapy session in progress. Marcus Webb's voice, calling out numbers as he worked on his range of motion. The same voice she'd heard calling her name across a rooftop in Baghdad while mortars fell like rain. She didn't stop. She kept walking. The morning sun hit the parking lot like a spotlight, harsh and unforgiving. Her car was in the same space where she'd left it yesterday. She loaded the gym bag into the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove toward the exit. The hospital shrunk in her rearview mirror, becoming smaller, becoming something that had happened to someone else. She had 12 minutes before she needed to be at the extraction point. 12 minutes to become someone new again. 12 minutes to figure out how to live inside a cover that had just been blown to pieces. 12 minutes before whatever came next walked through a door somewhere and changed everything. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that somewhere in the hospital, in an exam room in the emergency department, a patient was arriving under federal custody. A patient who would look up from a gurney and see something that would make everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd lost, mean something entirely different. The patient arrived at 2:51 a.m. under federal custody, 2 Marines in dress blues flanking his gurney like sentries at a tomb. He'd been an insurgent leader in Baghdad, the kind of man who'd ordered roadside bombs, the kind whose name Ashley had whispered into encrypted comms during her years in the Directorate of Operations. She was there to collect her final belongings from her locker, the folded flag inside wrapped in plastic like a relic. She should have been gone. Should have been home. Instead, she was walking past the trauma bay when the patient's head turned, his eyes locked onto her face, and something shifted in his expression like a satellite finding true north. One word. That's all he managed. Jinn. Devil. The call sign they'd used for her in the intelligence briefings, the one that meant precision and ghosts and operations that didn't officially happen. His voice was thin, papery, barely a whisper above the ventilator hiss, but it carried the weight of 8 years and 3 continents and a life that was supposed to stay buried. The Marine Corps colonel standing beside the gurney, a thick-shouldered man with a Silver Star ribbon on his chest, heard it. His head snapped toward Ashley like a weapon tracking. He pulled out his phone before she could move, before she could even process that her last secret was about to become public record. His finger scrolled through a secure military database, the kind with classified clearances and biometric locks. His jaw tightened. Then he began reading aloud, his voice steady as a courtroom testimony. Captain Ashley Cooper. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. He paused between each decoration like he was ringing bells at a funeral. First deployed to Baghdad 2008. Second tour 2010. Third deployment 2012 as part of Special Forces Command, Joint Operations. The words hung in the corridor like a challenge to everything that had happened over the past 6 weeks. Everything Mercer had orchestrated. Everything the hospital staff had believed. Then the doors to the main hallway swung open. A 2-star general in dress blues walked through them with a kind of presence that made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer by comparison. His boots hit the tile with the percussion of authority, click, 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 and he walked straight toward Ashley with his hand rising in a crisp, formal salute. Not a casual gesture. A salute rendered with the precision of someone addressing a superior officer. Captain Cooper, he said, his voice like gravel over concrete. Your service to this nation is extraordinary. The gathered crowd, nurses from the station, orderlies restocking supply carts, 2 residents frozen mid-conversation, fell absolutely silent. The kind of silence that happens when the entire room realizes they've been standing in a lie, and the lie has just been exposed by a general officer. Ashley returned the salute, her hand rising and falling with the muscle memory of 1,000 morning formations. She didn't smile. She didn't explain. She simply held the general's gaze while the reality of who she actually was bloomed across the faces of everyone watching. The next morning, FBI agents were already inside the hospital's records room. The digital forensics team had found what they were looking for within the first 48 hours, Dr. Mercer's fingerprints all over metadata that didn't belong to him. Timestamps altered on Ashley's personnel file. Credentials falsified. But that was only the beginning. The deeper they dug, the worse it got. The medication logs that Mercer had demanded be audited, the ones he'd used as the hammer to destroy her, they revealed his own operation. 18 months of diversion. Fentanyl. Oxycodone. Morphine. All of it redirected through surgical supply requisitions he'd personally authorized, routed through a pharmacy technician who'd already agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for immunity. The warrant was executed at 3:51 p.m. on a Wednesday. Security footage would later show FBI agents reading Mercer his rights in the main corridor, handcuffs applied with the clinical precision of a medical procedure. His face was the color of old bone. Dr. Patterson and Dr. Ruiz, the physicians who'd turned their backs on Ashley at the vending machine 6 weeks earlier, stood frozen near the nurse's station, coffee cups suspended in their hands like they'd been flash frozen in the moment they understood what they'd done. By evening, the mugshot was already on the local news. Dr. Richard Mercer's face, pale and jaw clenched, ran alongside a photograph of Ashley in dress uniform, her service ribbons a bright bar of color across her chest. The headline was merciless, decorated war hero working undercover at VA hospital exposes chief of medicine's drug diversion scheme. The chief nursing officer gave a statement about the professionalism of all staff involved without mentioning Ashley's name once, protecting the institution's liability while the truth walked out in handcuffs. 6 months later, Mercer was driving a medical supply van for a veterans non-profit, oxygen tanks secured in the back, wheelchairs folded beside them. His medical license was permanently revoked. His house was being sold to cover legal fees. He wore a polo shirt with a charity logo instead of a white coat, and nobody at the clinics recognized him when he delivered equipment to people he used to oversee as a physician. The fall was complete. The fall was thorough. The fall was exactly what he'd earned. But that wasn't where the story ended. Ashley stood in the same VA hospital corridor where Mercer had threatened her 6 months earlier, but this time she was wearing her dress uniform. The blue fabric was crisp, her hair in regulation style, her boots polished to a shine that caught the overhead lights. Around her neck hung a medal on a ribbon, not the ones from Baghdad, but a new commendation for undercover service to her country, for the 8 months of patient work that had exposed something no one else had seen. Marcus Webb sat in his wheelchair, but his eyes were clear. The surgery had finally stabilized his traumatic brain injury. The medications Ashley had monitored, the care she'd personally overseen, it had worked. His brain was healing. His memory was returning like a ship breaking through fog. She pinned the medal to his chest with hands that didn't shake. The crowd assembled, hospital staff, veterans, federal officials, watched in silence. Marcus looked down at the decoration, then up at Ashley's face, and touched the tattoo on his forearm. Her name, inked 8 years ago in Baghdad, suddenly meant something different than it had in the fog of his injury. "Captain," he said, and his voice held every memory they'd shared. I remember all of it." Ashley's hands remained steady, but her eyes reflected the fluorescent lights like still water. She adjusted the medal one final time, held his hand a moment longer than regulation required, and stepped back into position. The folded flag from her fallen teammate, the one that had lived in her locker, the only piece of her past she'd allowed herself to keep, was now mounted in a display case in the rehabilitation wing. A memorial. A reminder. A truth that couldn't be unseen. Dr. Patterson approached her after the ceremony, awkward and hollow-eyed. "Captain Cooper, I owe you an apology." "I should have." "You followed your chain of command, Doctor," Ashley said, cutting him off with parade ground courtesy. "No apology necessary." But her eyes were ice water, and he understood in that moment that some relationships, once broken, don't heal. They just become a scar you carry forever. She walked the corridors in uniform one final time, acknowledging salutes from staff who'd witnessed her humiliation, her suspension, her invisible resurrection. When she changed back into scrubs in the locker room, she wasn't shedding the uniform, she was choosing which one to wear. The nurse. The soldier. The investigator. All of them true. All of them her. General Vance had spoken during the ceremony with the kind of gravity that comes from a life spent in service. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. The words hung in the air like a truth that didn't need defending, because the evidence was standing right there in dress uniform, pinning medals on the chest of a man she'd carried 3 miles through enemy fire 8 years ago. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual value, please hit that subscribe button. If you've ever wondered what it takes to survive when everything working against you, leave a comment below. And if you believe that the quietest people in the room are sometimes the ones holding everything together, share this story with someone who needs to know that heroes walk among us every single day.